The crack that could have lost Britain. August 15th, 1940. RAF Acklington, the Northumberland moors, early morning. The sky was iron that day, a slab of low cloud streaked with contrails and the distant thunder of engines. On the grass strick at Acklington, ground crews moved like ants beneath the wings of Spitfires and Hurricanes, wrenching bolts, checking fuel lines, whispering last-minute prayers into gloved hands. Petrol smelled sweet and sharp in the cold air. The metal tasted of ozone after another night of dogfights. Pilots jogged across the apron with leather helmets and breath steaming, faces pulled tight by fatigue and focus. Every man there carried the knowledge that a single splintering crack in a wing could send him and his plane down in a heartbeat. Inside Hangar 3, amid the clank of spanners and the hiss of compressed air, Flight Sergeant Art Collins hunched over a repair bench. His fingers were black with glue and varnish. A strip of birch veneer lay across his knee. Collins was more mechanic than poet, the sort of man whose language was talk and tolerance. He pulled a cloth across a length of wing spar and checked the newly glued seam. The join line had to be invisible, but more than that, it had to hold on the stress. He tapped it with the butt of a screwdriver and listened for the note of solid wood. The note sounded wrong. A hairline spidered along the glue line, brittle as winter frost. "Not again," he muttered. Across the hangar, the squadron adjutant, a slim-laced man in a blue tunic, Flight Lieutenant George Harrow, stepped over to Collins, his boots scuffing the concrete. "We can't afford failures, Art. The lads are flying 3 sorties a day. The Sambos are coming in worse than ever. We need those repairs to hold." Collins spat into a gutter of oil and set the wrench down. "It's the glue, sir. The resin they're issuing. It's cracking under rapid temperature and stress cycling. Wings are working themselves loose after high G turns. We've had 2 near catastrophes this week." Harrow's jaw tightened. "Write it up. Get the parts list. We'll send it up the chain." A few miles away, beyond the rows of huts and the practice firing range, a man bent over a battered kitchen table in a farmhouse that smelled of porridge and horsehair. He was a farmer by trade, calloused hands, broad shoulders, and a face browned by wind, but his suit of overalls told a different story. On the shelf behind him sat jars labeled with neat copper plate, resin A, tannin mix, casein. He was Tom Hargreaves, part-time chemist, full-time tinkerer, and for all his village laughs, someone the RAF Maintenance Command would later have wished they had listened to sooner. Tom had not set out to be a wartime hero. Before the blackout and the rationing, he raised barley and kept a few head of cattle. But he had once been an assistant in a university chemistry lab before the family farm pulled him home. The skill stuck. When the ministry requisitioned farmland for improvised airstrips, the farmers swapped gossip over hedgerows for queries about propellant fumes and varnish recipes. Tom was curious. He asked questions. He mixed a jar of linseed with walnuts of rosin and a measure of glue, scribbling ratios on the back of a milk crate. 2 nights earlier, a pilot named Pilot Officer Jimmy Clark had returned from a scramble with his Hurricane's lower wing flexing like a wounded bird. The repair party had re-glued the leading edge in a hurry, but high-speed turns in combat had peeled the laminate away like a scab. He'd told Collins in the mess, "Felt like I was flying a kite with a missing rib. The plane shivered in the roll, thought that was the end of me." His words echoed in Collins' head, and in Tom Hargreaves too, after an impromptu visit to Hangar T and a nosy look at the damaged spar. Tom believed the problem was thermal and shear related. The standard wartime resin hardened brittle when the plane warmed under sun and then chilled again within minutes.
Stress from sharp banking placed shearing forces right where the glue had the least give. The government adhesives were formulated for peacetime economy, cheap, quick, and suitable for furniture and crate making, not the vicious alternating loads of dogfight maneuvers. He set to work. At dusk, while the village slept with shutters pulled tight and blackout curtains taped in place, Tom boiled a kettle in an oil drum and began distilling. He mixed animal casein from the farmhouse dairy with powdered resin, adding small quantities of glycerin and a dash of powdered cork, an odd textural filler he'd once used to stop a leaky milk churn. The concoction smelled faintly of burned sugar and hay. He tested its tack on shavings of spruce and birch, bending them under a vise and then hammering them with a mallet. The join held. Not only that, it sang, like a good join should when tapped. The next afternoon, under a grey sky, Tom brought one of the suspect wing panels to his yard. Together they stripped the old brittle resin away with solvents that clouded the air, then applied Tom's mixture by hand, pressing veneer into place with clamps and heated irons. They watched the seam set, slow and steady, and then ran it through a battery of crude tests: torque, flexion, rapid temperature change, repeated hammer strikes. The join flexed, absorbed load, and did not cleave. "That's no fiddling glue," Collins said. "That's proper engineering." Word traveled faster than an air raid siren. A young sergeant from Maintenance Command came with a notepad, then an inspector, and finally an officer in civilian coat who introduced himself as Commander Elliot Marsh from the Ministry of Aircraft Production. He smelled of tobacco and formal worry. Marsh watched the tests with the grim patience of a man used to disappointment. "Are you sure this isn't some home-brew nonsense?" Marsh asked. "I'm a farmer, sir. I know wood, I know water, I know what splinters under a plow. I also know a thing about casein binding from university days. Mix that with a bit of flexibility, and you stop the splintering." Marsh pulled out his notebook. "Take a sample to the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. If that holds under lab conditions, we'll run field trials." It was the first time Tom had ever been sent with a government vehicle, a battered lorry piling down the road with his jars jostling in the back. He felt absurdly proud and terrified, as if he were taking his prize pig to market and someone might find it underweight. Back at Acklington, Collins and Harrow watched the horizon for Messerschmitts and whispered about new tactics. Neither of them could be sure if a farmer's glue would change the outcome of a dogfight, but they both knew this: if the wings stayed whole, the pilots might come back. And if the pilots came back, Britain would still stand. Outside the hangar, a Spitfire began its pre-flight routine. A propeller spun, and the aircraft's fuselage sang into the morning. The repaired wing hung proud and true. For the first time in weeks, Collins felt something like hope that didn't taste of fear.
The test that should have failed. August 22nd, 1940, Farnborough Aerodrome, Hampshire. Rain hammered the tin roof of the Royal Aircraft Establishment, turning the runway outside into a silver sheet of water. Inside, the structural test hangar, engineers in white coats paced back and forth, clipboards in hand. They stood around a long steel rig bristling with clamps, pistons, and pressure gauges, a torture device designed for one purpose: to tear aircraft wings apart. On the table sat the unlikeliest object in the room: a small jar of cloudy, amber-colored glue, Hargreaves glue. Tom stood off to the side, cap in hand, looking painfully out of place among men with fountain pens, slide rules, and Oxbridge accents. His boots still carried traces of country mud. Engineers whispered behind him, some smirking. A farmer claiming he could out-engineer government chemists? Ridiculous. But in the center of the rig, clamped down and bolted tight, was the real test:
a laminated wing segment repaired using Tom's adhesive. It looked ordinary enough: pale birch veneer, spruce spar, doped fabric. Nothing to hint at its importance. Chief Engineer Dr. Malcolm Firth, a gaunt man with steel-rimmed spectacles, stepped forward. "We begin axial load testing at incremental pressure." The pistons hissed. The wooden section flexed slightly. The technicians noted readings. Again. More pressure. The rig vibrated. Still the seam held. Tom watched with his stomach twisted. His whole life had never felt as fragile as that glue joint in the rig. If it failed, hundreds of aircraft would continue to fly with brittle seams. If it held, Britain might withstand the brutal strain of the Battle of Britain. Dr. Firth frowned, inspecting the gauge. Increased to combat stress loads, 8G equivalents. The machine groaned. The wood bent unnaturally, like a bow drawn too far. An engineer whispered, "Any second now." But the glue didn't crack. It flexed. It absorbed. It refused to fail. Firth's eyebrows rose. Interesting. Increase load to catastrophic threshold. Let's see when it gives. The pistons slammed down. The wing segment shuddered, then snapped. But not at the glue joint. The wood split elsewhere. The seam itself was intact. A stunned silence filled the hangar. Firth walked over, tracing a fingertip along the seam that should have been the first point of failure. He cleared his throat. The adhesive bond exceeds the structural strength of the surrounding wood. One of the younger engineers looked back at Tom, disbelief turning into awe. That's not possible. Tom gave a polite half shrug. "Cows taught me more than chemistry ever did, sir. There's a lot of strength in the things nature builds." Firth closed his notebook with a snap. "This goes to ministry approval immediately." August 27, 1940. RAF Headquarters, Bentley Priory. In a room heavy with cigarette smoke and tension, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding reviewed a report stamped urgent across the top. Details of Hargreaves' adhesive were summarized in crisp language. The conclusion was underlined in red. Recommended for immediate adoption in frontline aircraft repairs. Allows Spitfire and Hurricane wing spars to maintain integrity during extreme G-forces, potentially decisive in sustaining RAF combat capability. He set the paper down. Through his window, he could hear the distant thrum of scrambling fighters. Britain was running on fumes. Aircraft destroyed faster than they could be built, pilots exhausted, mechanics crews patching planes in hours rather than days. If wings fractured mid-fight, the Battle of Britain might already be lost. He turned to his adjutant. "Get this to every maintenance group today. And find out who this Hargreaves fellow is. I want his formula in production by week's end." September 1940, various RAF stations. The glue spread like wildfire. Factories began mixing it in sealed vats, filling tins stamped adhesive, Hargreaves type. Ground crews applied it to wing roots, spars, and laminated skins. Within days, dozens of fighter wings had been structurally reinforced. The jokes vanished. No one laughed at the farmer's glue anymore. On the third week of September, Pilot Officer Jimmy Clark rolled his repaired Hurricane into a near-vertical climb during a dogfight with BF-110s over Kent. He yanked the stick hard, more violently than any manual suggested, pushing the plane into blackout territory. The aircraft groaned, but the wings held firm. He came back with bullet holes, a shredded rudder, and a perfect wing seam. Mechanics stared at it, touching the joint with reverence and disbelief. "Whatever's in that stuff," Collins said, "it just saved his life." Across Britain, the same story repeated. Pilots pulled brutal turns. Wings flexed but did not fail. The RAF stayed flying. The farmer's ridiculous glue, the one everyone mocked, was quietly keeping the nation alive.
The glue that held back the Luftwaffe. September 15, 1940, London, 11:02 a.m. The city shook under the thunder of engines. Dozens of Dornier bombers flew in formation over the outskirts of London, their shadows crawling across rooftops and broken chimneys. Below them, the wail of air raid sirens merged with the rattling of anti-aircraft fire. Britain was burning, but it was not beaten. High above the haze, Spitfires and Hurricanes screamed into the fight, twisting and rolling through explosions of flak smoke. The sunlight flashed across their wings now reinforced with a glue mixture invented in a farmer's kitchen. Inside Hurricane P-3520, Squadron Leader Ben Withers clenched the stick as his aircraft shook under a burst of cannon fire. He rolled hard right and dove past a Messerschmitt 109. The maneuver should have broken his wing spars clean in half, but the joint held. He pulled into a climbing spiral, the G-forces pulling at his eyelids, threatening blackout. A voice crackled in his headset. "Withers, you're pulling her too hard." He gritted his teeth. "She can take it." And she did. On this day, Battle of Britain Day, the RAF fought off the largest Luftwaffe assault yet. Pilots pushed their machines past every limit, executing violent maneuvers that would have torn the wings off earlier models. But the reinforced seams held, the glue flexed, absorbed, and endured. The Luftwaffe lost more aircraft than in any previous battle. Britain survived the day with its fighter force intact. Far away from the chaos, in a quiet village surrounded by barley fields, Tom Hargreaves listened to the distant rumble of aerial combat. Every time he heard a plane returning low and limping, he stepped outside, staring upward, whispering a hope that the wings had held. He had no medals, no uniform, no mention in briefing rooms, but in the sky above, hundreds of men were alive because of him, and they didn't even know it. Late September 1940, Ministry of Aircraft Production, London. Stacks of reports were piled on Commander Elliot Marsh's desk, field evaluations from ARF engineers. The patterns were clear. Fewer in-flight structural failures, stronger wing root integrity, increased survivability in high G turns, improved repair times. Marsh lit a cigarette, took one drag, and stamped out the match. He ordered, "Get production increased. This adhesive is now standard issue." Officials debated patent rights, supply lines, chemical sourcing. They drafted official names: casein-based flexible resin, type H. But among maintenance crews and pilots, the name that stuck was simpler: Hargreaves Glue. October 1940, RAF Biggin Hill. In a crowded hangar, with mechanics shouting over the ring of hammers and the squeal of trolley jacks, Flight Sergeant Collins inspected another returning Spitfire. The pilot jumped down, helmet in hand, grinning ear to ear despite smoke rising from the engine cowling. "She held, Art. I yanked her past 8 Gs chasing a yellow nose. Felt like she'd snapped clean off. But look at her, good as ever." Collins crouched beneath the wing and tapped the laminate. The seam was perfect, no cracking, no lifting. He placed a palm against the smooth birch veneer and allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. In the maintenance logs, Collins wrote one sentence: "Hargreaves adhesive recommended for permanent integration." November 1940, Hargreaves Farm, Surrey. One foggy morning, a black Humber staff car rolled up the muddy path to Tom Hargreaves' farmhouse. A man in uniform stepped out, an RAF officer with polished boots. Tom met him at the gate, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Mr. Hargreaves?" "Aye." The officer handed him a sealed letter stamped Ministry of Aircraft Production. Tom stared at it, confused. The officer cleared his throat. "Your adhesive mixture has been approved for nationwide implementation. Thousands of aircraft are now using your formula. We're told it saved, well, countless lives." Tom blinked. "My glue, that old thing has kept our pilots flying," the officer said. "Britain owes you more than we can say." Tom felt the words hit him like a weight. He looked down at the calloused hands that had milked cows, repaired fences, mixed chemicals in chipped jars. He had never thought of himself as a savior, just a man trying to help, the only way he knew how. Across Britain, through the worst days of 1940, Spitfires and Hurricanes soared into battle with wings strengthened by a farmer's invention. Pilots survived maneuvers that should have torn them from the sky.
The RAF endured when it should have shattered. And history would remember the Battle of Britain as a triumph of courage, leadership, and strategy. But in the shadows of that victory was a simpler truth. Sometimes, the difference between survival and defeat comes down to a single jar of glue mixed in a farmhouse shed by a man who refused to let his country fall apart.
December 1940. RAF Uxbridge, Fighter Command Headquarters. Snow drifted against the windows as Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding reviewed a stack of reports on his desk. Pilot losses were still severe, too many empty beds in too many barracks. But something else stood out, something extraordinary. Aircraft survival rates had jumped. Structural failures had plummeted. Dozens of pilots had returned from missions that should have torn the wings from their Hurricanes and Spitfires. Dowding closed the folder and tapped it thoughtfully. "Find the man responsible for this adhesive," he ordered quietly. "He may have done more for Fighter Command than some of our aircraft designers." But by the time word filtered through the bureaucracy, Tom Hargreaves had already returned to his quiet life. He didn't wait for medals or recognition. He didn't expect thanks. He simply went back to repairing farm gates, checking his cattle, and, when no one was looking, mixing jars of varnish and glue with the same patient hands that had helped save Britain's skies. February 1941. RAF Maintenance Unit, Coventry. Engineers crowded around a crate stenciled Adhesive Resin Type H. They knew the story by now. A farmer had created a glue that behaved like a miracle, resisting shear forces that shattered standard joints. They brushed it onto wing roots, laminated spars, and the fragile wooden skin panels of their fighters. One senior mechanic ran his thumb along a newly reinforced seam and nodded with satisfaction. "This'll hold," he murmured. "It always does." RAF crews began leaving tiny hand-carved initials on reinforced wing panels, small marks of gratitude. HHR, HG Mix, or simply, "Thank you, farmer," scratched with a pocket knife. No one told the ministry. No one needed to. The men who kept the planes flying knew exactly whose hands had kept them alive. March 1941, Surrey countryside. Tom stood in his yard repairing a broken wooden crate when he heard the rumble of engines overhead. 2 Spitfires streaked across the sky, gleaming under the early spring sun. They banked low over his farm, almost playfully, wings dipping in a gentle salute. Tom watched them with a soft, bewildered smile. Were they saluting him? They couldn't possibly know, but maybe. One of the pilots, miles up above, looked down at the patchwork fields below and tapped the side of his cockpit. "Here's to the man who keeps us together," he said to no one in particular. The Spitfires roared off toward the coast. Later that year, the Battle of Britain was over. The world praised Churchill's speeches, Dowding's strategy, and the pilots' unbreakable courage. Historians chronicled the technological marvels, the radar towers, and the bravery of the few. And yet, quietly, humbly, the RAF's wings stayed whole because of one forgotten figure. Not a general, not a scientist, not a celebrated engineer. Just a farmer, with jars of resin, milk casein, cork dust, and a stubborn belief that everything, even Britain itself, could be held together with the right glue. Tom Hargreaves never sought recognition, but the war machines he strengthened carried his legacy across every inch of British sky. His ridiculous glue became a silent guardian, keeping Spitfires and Hurricanes in one piece through the darkest hours of the conflict. Because sometimes the smallest, simplest invention, created far from the noise of battle, does more for victory than anyone will ever know.